Got to introduce you.
It's fine.
All right, I'll start Dan's introduction as hopefully everyone files in. Dr. Daniel Putnam is Cooperative Extension Specialist and agronomist in the Agriculture Experiment Station at UC. Dan conducts field and laboratory research related to subsurface drip irrigation on alfalfa and harvested forage crops. He works closely with cooperative extension farm advisors in the counties, with UC scientists, and with the alfalfa industry in California. Dan specializes in alfalfa and forage crop systems, forage quality and utilization, alternative field crops, cellulosic energy crops, and crop ecology. Thank you.
Is that remote still on there? No.
Yeah, I didn't unhook it.
Okay.
So it should still work.
Where is it? There. Okay. Okay. Thanks very much. I'm gonna. I hope my voice holds out here. I got a cold. I visited my grandchildren, and there's a certain biological study that takes place in daycares. So I think that's what I'm experiencing. One of the things that really is striking, I really appreciated the morning's presentations, is that remember that agriculture, the whole purpose is to produce food. And now that our secretary is out of the room, I want to ask those of you, what's our number one agricultural product in California? Does anybody know that? No? Agricultural product? Dairy. Dairy products are still our number one agricultural product. And alfalfa, really, we'd probably not grow much alfalfa at all if we didn't have 1.5 million dairy cows in California. And so that's a really key part of what we're doing, is producing food from these crops. So let's not forget that. And also, when we're talking about water use efficiency, we have to think about the amount of food produced or the amount of crop produced per unit water or per unit greenhouse gas or per unit impact on the environment, because that's really the whole purpose of agriculture. So I think that's really a key issue to think about. So I'm going to share with you some of our experiences with working with subsurface drip irrigation. I've really valued my relationship with the Netafim folks over the last 4 or 5 years that we've been working on this, and the collaboration also with other states on this issue, Arizona and New Mexico, and because alfalfa is the number 4 economic crop in the United States. Those of you may not know that. It's actually very important in virtually all the western states. About almost 48% of the alfalfa in the United States is produced in the West under irrigation. This was our story last fall. Those of us who live in California know this. Severe, in fact, I really like this nomenclature, exceptional drought. They're trying to come up with new terms, in terms of drought. And this was California's status, and of course, this was this spring. And so we can all now relax and go back to sleep because we don't have to worry about water anymore, right? Well, this is the nature of a dry region of the world. We live with large amounts and small amounts of water periodically. It's only available periodically. One of the most worrisome things, of those of you from DWR will recognize this kind of graph showing the depletion of the groundwater in the southern San Joaquin Valley. We have high years and low years, but the fact is, over periods of time, we've been really stressing our groundwater resources in many regions of California, not so much in this area, but in other areas. And so we have to think about water long term. And so that's a really key issue. This is actually, Bob Curtis, I don't think is no longer in the room, but this is the alfalfa acreage. Used to be the number 1 acreage crop in California. It's gone down quite a bit. Almonds have gone up quite a bit. By the way, we're both right, because hay acreage is alfalfa plus lots of other hay, and that's about 1.5 million acres in California. So hay is the biggest acreage crop, but alfalfa is second to almonds now, and I'm really happy that almonds are now the bad boy of water consumption. But both of those A crops, alfalfa and almonds, are major water users in California. For a perspective, we're probably talking about somewhere between 4 and 5 million acre feet in alfalfa being used every year. All over the state of California. Bob, I was just joking about this. This is my graph for the acreage. And so both Bob and I were right. He presented the hay acreage, and this is the alfalfa alone acreage, which has actually gone down quite a bit over the period of time. This is the milk cow dynamic in California, which is really driving the interest in hay. But it's leveled off over periods of time. But we're also entering into an era of internationalization of both forages and dairy. Dairy is, I think, number 2 export crop or product from California. And we have to think of these water issues not just locally but internationally, because I think I read in the paper this morning there was about 45% of California's agriculture is exported. It's a huge component. And not only that, but we export to the rest of the United States too. So, I mean, the water issues are local, but they're also international. I also just published a blog on this issue with Saudi Arabia is curtailing their alfalfa production in the kingdom. And over the next 3 years, they'll go down to very low levels, creating a world demand for about 1.5 to 2 million metric tons per year of alfalfa hay. So it'll have to come from somewhere. And so North Africa, United States, South America, so forth. And this is the China demand over the last 10 years have gone from 0 up to, it's actually this year is over closer to 1.5 million metric tons shipped from the West Coast to the United States. So a lot of that is water. It's both virtual water here, but it's also water limitations in other countries. What are the future trends for this crop? Well, it was dethroned as the number 1 acreage crop, which we'll concede that point here, Bob. But there's always a tug of war between the restrictions on acreage and production due to competition from other crops and water limitations, and a strong demand from Western Dairies, exports, horses, and other livestock. We have, if actually you add together all of the livestock in California, it's at least 4 million heads of various species, not including actually sheep and goats, which are numerous as well. And there's certainly a need for higher yields and limited of land availability, and this is really a global issue. That's, the way I see it, is a global issue. We have to deal with it here in California, but it's really an international issue. Lower water use, and there's the issue of water transfers from both within agriculture, but also when the cities need water. And I like this concept of sustainable intensification that I think you brought up today. I think that's really key. We have to look at high yields, high productivity under limited resources. And I believe that alfalfa will remain a major crop for many years to come, unless, of course, all of the cows are kicked out of California, which who knows if that will happen. But we certainly are a major milk consumption state as well as a producing state. I published this a couple of years ago, why alfalfa is the best crop to have in a drought, and I think it's proved to be somewhat correct. It's got a lot more flexibility than other crops do with regards to drying down the crop. Growers have done this over the last 5 years of drought, where they move water within their farms from crop to crop. You can't do that with too many crops. And so alfalfa's got a lot of, I'll show some data here that support this. So I think in spite of the fact that it has a large water footprint, it actually is pretty positive in its water attributes because of its flexibility. But let's turn to SDI. Now, I'm not one of the opinion that SDI subsurface drip irrigation is the only solution. I think we have to be non-religious about our views about, irrigation efficiency can exist with all different kinds of systems. But what we've done over the last few years is deal with case studies. We visited actually closer to 30 farms, California and Arizona, documenting the successes and failures. And also done controlled studies, and those are still ongoing. And we have some out here if anybody is interested in coming out and taking a look at them. We have 3 or 4 studies here on the campus. We have some down at Kearney Ag Center in Fresno, and also down in El Centro in the desert, low desert. We're looking at variety interactions, deficit irrigation, and I'll show a little bit of data on that, spacing studies and distribution uniformity issues, and working with colleagues on this issue here, which is actually one of the biggest impediments, in my view, to using this technology in alfalfa. So we have about 84% surface irrigation in alfalfa here in California, about 14% sprinklers, and somewhere around 2 to 3% under drip irrigation. We have actually some very successful farms that have implemented SDI, but it's still a fairly small minority of our farms. This is the typical way of doing things where you flood the fields. The fields are laser leveled, the water moves down the fields, and the fields are flood irrigated. And this is the most common method here in California. And I'll get into some of the negatives with flood irrigation and why I think that SDI might be one of the techniques that can be used. And here's some of the activities that we've been undergoing with El Centro and Davis trials, field visits, and working with farmers and working a lot with people in the industry to figure out, I mean, we're still on a learning curve, at least I am, about this technology, and I think that there's a lot to be known about it. So I'm going to give you sort of our current understanding. In my view, to consider SDI in this crop, you must have improved yields. It's a higher cost system than surface systems, and you must understand your source of water and water quality and delivery systems so that you can utilize the system successfully. And you must be prepared, in my view, for a higher level of management. In other words, it's got to be managed correctly. It's not the kind of turnkey system that some people think. Although in some respects it is, but there are some management issues that have to be paid attention to. We did some economic analysis of this briefly. We still have more to do on this. Usually around $2,000 to $2,500 type of investment per acre. But if you amortize that out, with the different systems, you have the pumps and the different kinds of infrastructure that lasts maybe 15, 20, 25 years. Then you have the drip tapes, which may last a shorter period of time. And we've used a 6-year amortization on the drip tapes. It comes out to an additional about $300 a year. And the question is, do we have enough productivity to pay for it? So this is a graph showing you that it increased cost at the price of hay. As the price of hay goes up, of course, the cost for installation goes down. As the cost of installation of the system goes up, the cost goes up. And so if you have very cheap hay, your cost per acre is going to be much higher. And of course, you can keep that. We think that it's somewhere between a half a ton or a ton and a half, generally speaking, required to pay for the system. That is, without subsidies from the various, say NRCS has been very good. Actually, this is a point, I don't know if Karen Ross is still here or not, but the question is whether or not there's a lot of incentives from the state to shift from surface irrigation systems to pressurized systems. It doesn't look that way to me. So, and the question is, is there something policy-wise that can help out on that? The question is, are those yields there? And most of the growers have reported much higher yields in drip irrigation compared with check flood irrigation, on the order of 20 to 30%. And this was supported by controlled studies over time. About 3 tons per acre improvement over flood irrigation. So the question is, why is that? It's in the 20 to 35% range. Why do we see this? Why would we expect to see this improvement in yields? And that's I'm going to explore that a little bit here. Well, the first is, in my view, is superior distribution uniformity over space. So this is a kind of a poorly designed flood irrigation system. You see the water's only going over to one side. This one's much better designed, but the way the system should work is the water should be moving down the field in a uniform fashion, in a predictable fashion. So that's in a well-designed system. Some of them are not well-designed. But there are going to be differences between the top and the bottom of the field, regardless of how well designed they are. And these are well-known problems. For example, if you look at the source of water here in check flood systems, the water moves down the field. It might take maybe 12 hours of watering. And so this side of the field gets more water than this side of the field. So you get maybe excess water here. You get less water here. These are generally between 1,200 and 1,300 foot runs. And so you get ideal perhaps in here, too much water here and too little water here. And then the other problem you get is the flooding at the end of the fields. This kind of accumulation of moisture that actually kills the crop at the ends of these check flood fields. And this is very, very common. These are well known. Most people understand these pretty well. Here's the accumulation of water at the end of the field. Really, standing water is not a good thing for alfalfa production. I grew up in the Midwest and took agronomy courses in the Midwest, and they said, well, you know, you should never plant alfalfa on heavy ground, and you should never allow it to become flooded. All right, so we moved to California. What do? We plant alfalfa on heavy ground, and we flood it all the time. And you know, it works. I mean, we can get it. It's a system that actually works, but the fact is it has its negatives. And this is a very common thing. This is just south of my house in Woodland, showing tail end damage. You can see the tail end damage here. This is actually exacerbated by salinity, but this is in Woodland. So almost every flood irrigated field, we see this kind of problem in check flood fields. So the second reason I think that we have an advantage of SDI over check flood is distribution uniformity in time. So the other one was in space, and this is in time. Well, the ability to charge a field within hours or days, and most flood irrigated fields require 4 to 12 days, depending upon your flow rates, to actually irrigate the entire field. Why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because alfalfa really only has a 28-day growth period, of which about 14 to 17 days you cannot irrigate. Because you're cutting, you're drying the crop down before you're cutting, and you have to wait till the crop is cured before you can bale. So you can't irrigate during those cutting periods, and so you only have really 14 days. So growers are either going to irrigate once or twice. So that's the thing. This annoying thing we do, which is cutting all the time. You don't wait till the end of the year. You have to cut 6 or 7, 8 times over the year. And so what happens over the field on a single irrigation is you irrigate once, you irrigate twice, and then at the beginning of a 7-day irrigation schedule, basically this gets water much earlier than this, and in that 14-day window, you have distribution uniformity problems across that field in time. In other words, some parts of the field get water earlier than other parts of the field. The third reason, I think, is the ability to maintain turgor pressure. And we got to remember that turgor pressure drives herbaceous plant growth. In other words, there's some very elegant studies that have shown that if you have a wilted plant, it essentially stops growing. Right? So that's a physiological reality. And particularly with a crop like alfalfa where you have this, you need to have as much herbaceous growth as possible. We want to keep that crop from getting wilted at any time during the year. The other part has to do with the cracking and soil type issues because we have cracking clay soils in many parts of California, and that's due to a wetting and drying pattern. And so this is really hard on the root systems of alfalfa. And so we've seen that as a real benefit with SDI. And the fourth reason is to manipulating irrigation schedules to match ET, evapotranspiration. Essentially, any schedule can be more or less matched, can irrigate every day, many hours or a few hours, or maintaining turgor pressure during that time, or even irrigating close to harvest. And that's unlike check flood irrigation, which is either yes or no. So either you put on 4 inches or not. So if the crop requires 1.5 inches of water, sorry for my advanced English units here. How many millimeters is that, Gene? You know? Anyway, so a crop might require 1.5 inches of water. With check flood irrigation, you cannot deliver 1.5 inches of water. You have to deliver either whatever the system delivers, maybe 4 to 6 inches of water in one irrigation. So the growers often deficit irrigate their crops just because they can't irrigate in between these 14-day periods. So I think that's the reason. This illustrates this. This is actually our own data showing the ET in the red. This is the ET accumulation over the year. Here's the actual amount of water we were able to apply with drip systems here on the campus. And this is the way a single irrigation will work with flood irrigation. So you have periods where you have too much water, and then you have deficits, you have too much water, deficits, and so forth. So drip irrigation allows fewer periods of deficits than you would get with check flood irrigation. So the key question here is, can a system follow ET? Can you, has anybody seen this movie? I don't know. And can it recharge the profile? And in recharging the profile is really important. It's really different than what Natty presented today, which is irrigating the root system only. In this crop, this is a broadcast crop, so we do want a full profile. We want to have that profile in the root zone to be full when the crop begins growing. The distribution uniformity was not perfect in these drip systems that we've seen throughout California and Arizona. You get this kind of corrugation. I'll show some more pictures like that in the field. And we think that might be a 10 to 20% yield hit just due to this kind of corrugation effect. And that's a spacing issue. So we have trials here to try to figure out this ideal spacing question. Which is really different than row crops, because row crops are going to be dictated, like in the case of tomato, by the equipment that you're using. And we have more to learn on this issue in terms of flow rates. And these are the two different, in between the drip lines and right over the drip lines, you see a difference in growth there. And that's because of the this kind of differential distribution uniformity within the field. And so you can see that in this case here, these are where the drip lines are, and here's in between the drip lines. So the grower was not able to. Now, keep in mind, these fields were yielding at 14 to 16 ton yields, whereas the average in California is about 7 to 8. So they're getting very high yields. They're very happy with their yields, but I think we could do better. We have to work with the spacing issue and some of the irrigation management issues. So this is showing that again. The lower root growth in between the drip lines because of distribution uniformity. And we have more to learn about optimum spacing, I think, under these kind of broadcast systems. The rooting systems are quite a bit different. This is Khaled Bali has developed this data down from El Centro. And so seeing these differences between drip irrigation and flood irrigation in terms of rooting patterns. So what we've learned is that the problems in stand establishment really last a long time, and growers really need to use sprinklers to bring up this crop. You can't bring it up with drip irrigation, in my view. You need to have a way of filling that profile. So we have recommended to growers to keep in the capacity to do a flood irrigation over the space of the time that they expect the system to be in. There's a lot of reasons for that. One is to fill the profile when necessary. The second is for gopher management. The third is for salinity. And we talked about salinity earlier here, but in many areas of California, salinity is a big issue. We've had growers that have actually over-irrigated, and they found that this is actually not alfalfa, these are weeds. They've killed their alfalfa right over the drip lines because they've over-irrigated. They don't know quite how to do the scheduling because they've tried to make the water go in between the drip lines, and as a result, they've over-irrigated, the water's come to the surface, kills the plants. And it's happened in several different fields. One of the things that really have been satisfying about this is visiting so many growers and learning from them, because we can learn things from them that we can't put into our controlled studies here at UC Davis. Recommend to maintain the ability to flood irrigate over that period of time. I think that's a really important capacity. We can't be religious about this, saying, well, I'm only going to use drip irrigation. Well, there might be a reason to use sprinklers or to use flood irrigation. And that's, I think in this case of alfalfa, there's really an important reason for doing this. Rodents are perhaps the major challenge for SDI in this crop, as are Roger Baldwin, who's, I don't know if Roger made it this morning, but he says alfalfa is just an ideal habitat for rodents, and they do recreational chewing on drip lines, and you can see here what they're doing, and this is our drip leak discovery method, driving your pickup truck into the leak area. And growers get very frustrated with this. And it's really one of the reasons we've had a number of growers that have just walked away from the system. They just cannot handle this. And I think there's an issue to be said for farming out the management of gophers and some of the other management issues for management of drip irrigation, because if you don't control gophers, this system is not going to work. And I think you have to take we see gopher damage in other irrigation systems, but it doesn't damage your irrigation system. We see gopher damage to the crop. So there's a lot of different approaches to this, but we have to take a professional view of gopher management because it is so devastating to drip systems in alfalfa. Can you save water? I think you can. The water savings might be modest depending upon the situation. We would estimate 5 to 10%, but it's highly soil type dependent. And the yield is directly related to ET, and if we get higher yields, remember, we may not save water because you're actually producing more of a crop. And so, but we can save on certainly evaporative component of that. We still have a lot of questions about whether ET is genuinely different under check flood irrigation compared with this. I think it might be. And it depends upon all of these factors. But the key thing we have to keep in mind is the water use efficiency is the yield per unit water. And really that to me is the most important thing. We have to think about high productivity issues. But I think there's more to be learned about this. Certainly there's prevention of off-site movement of water from surface irrigation systems and water quality impacts that I think are pretty significant. This shows us, I want to show you some deficit irrigation work that we've done here on the campus. And these are drip irrigated fields, and we had the full needs of the crop were about at 39 or 40 inches of water. And we cut off the irrigations in June or July, and had applications of about 19 or 30 inches of water on these fields. And here are the fields out here at UC Davis. And this shows you what we've seen is that actually at 50% of the ET, we still get 80% of the full yields. And at cutting down to about 75% of the season-long ET, we still get 95% of full yields. So how's that happen? This is my point about this is the best crop to have in a drought, because you can actually cut back the irrigation waters on this crop. This is with drip irrigation. I think you can do a better job with it with drip irrigation because you can give it small amounts of water to keep it alive, in spite of the fact that you're not fully irrigating it. And the reason that this works is because we're doing this all late in the year where the yields are lower anyway. So the late in the season, the yields, even a fully irrigated crop, are quite a bit lower than they are in the first 3 or 4 cuttings. These are all the cuttings over the year. And so as a result, you get a fairly decent, water productivity, if you will, with deficit irrigation. I guess I'm convinced that with this crop, we will be dealing with deficit irrigations year in, year out more than we are fully irrigated crops, just because of the water transfer issues, the drought, the periodic drought issues, the economics of it, the fact that other crops will be first in line for the fresh water that's there. And so I think this is something we're really looking hard at with drip irrigation. This is some data from Will Horwath and his group, showing that drip irrigation actually reduces significantly the amount of N2O emissions. And this was done on these drip fields here on campus, showing really very big reductions in net N2O emissions. And this is because these flooding events, I think, Will, you're in the audience here, it's because they create this rich environment with plenty of nitrogen in the soil for emissions to occur. Isn't that correct?
Yes. I mean, most of my program activity is at the surface.
Right.
So if you're not wetting the surface, you kind of reducing that dramatically, and you have less N2O emissions there.
Okay. So this is back to this point of crop production per unit of impact, and so that's a key issue here. Labor is another big issue that's going to face our farmers in a big way. check flood irrigation is very labor intensive. And I think that's going to be one of the driving forces for interest in more advanced methods in the future. And so a lot of growers that we surveyed, we did a survey of drip irrigation, were quite satisfied with it. There are some that were not as satisfied. I think those were the ones that had a lot of gopher issues. But generally, they're pretty satisfied. I'm going to go over this real quickly in terms of the advantages and disadvantages of SDI. I think water use per acre, SDI might be a little better. Per crop unit, that is per ton, also better. Energy use per acre, probably that favors flood irrigation. Flood irrigation is a gravity-fed system for the most part, and there's little pumping involved, but we have a pressurized system here, so there's some advantages there. But energy use per unit of production, if yields are increased, the drip irrigation would be superior. Willie?
But because the N2O emissions have been reduced, the global warming potential would be benefit SDI.
There you go.
Even though it's using more energy.
Even though it's using more energy, yeah. And particularly when you put into the mix the issue of energy use per unit of production, and if we can maintain these high yield levels, that's really the key issue. So greenhouse gas per unit of production, not fully known, but likely to be lower in SDI. We have to develop some more data on this, I think. Irrigation management, clear advantage to SDI. I think we can do a better job with SDI, with matching ET and other kinds of irrigation management issues. To refill the profile, actually flood irrigation is superior here. If we want to refill a profile more rapidly, you need to use flood irrigation. Germination, you need to use sprinklers with this crop. There's no way that I know of. We've recommended to people, actually been communicating with people around the world about, can I bring my crop up with drip irrigation? I'd say no. And I've talked a lot with the NetFM folks about that, and they agree with me that you really need to use either sprinklers or flood irrigation for germination and stand establishment. Salinity. Salinity is going to be an issue with SDI and probably an advantage for flood irrigation, at least in the short term. So in saline areas, we are definitely recommending integration between the occasional use of flood irrigation. We actually, today, our crew is planting a new trial down at Westside Field Station with, I have a theory that actually we can do a better job with high saline waters. Alfalfa is pretty saline resistant. It's actually pretty tolerant of salinity. The key issues are the soil issues and infiltration issues that you get with saline waters. And so we're installing a new trial there using drip irrigation to deliver saline water more uniformly, we think, that's our hypothesis, to the crop, and combining that with occasional flood irrigations, because you have to work on moving those salts down the profile. Wildlife. Now, alfalfa is a very important wildlife benefit to wildlife, and that's really clearly favoring a flood irrigation system. If you do away with all that surface water, you're not going to have the wading birds and so forth. So there's an implication there. I hate to say that to the NetFM people. Yields, SDI probably superior. Standing longevity, SDI, we've seen a lot of evidence of this. Controlling fertilizers, much better with SDI. Weed intrusion, much better with SDI. You don't have a wet surface, so you're not germinating the weeds. Surface runoff, far superior with SDI. Oxygen to the root system. We don't have actually much data on this, but I think this is kind of an important issue, that how much oxygen is available to the root zone. With flood irrigation, we go through, sort of periodic mud pies compared with cement blocks. Labor, rodent management is a negative for SDI, and flexibility of deficit irrigation. Both systems actually work there, but I think we can probably use SDI better. So in summary, it's not appropriate for all farms, and we really have to have a yield potential and a higher level of management. Variation of price of alfalfa hay is a big worry for alfalfa growers as to whether they can pay for this. Improved yields are certainly possible, and possibility of improved stand longevity less weeds and labor savings. Water benefits, ability to do deficit irrigation, and yield per unit water are all advantages to this system. And we do need a sustained effort to really try to figure out how to control these issues here. Rodent management is probably number one. Scheduling and spacing issues and water quality issues are always important. Here's some of the wildlife that likes to hang out in alfalfa fields. So with that, I'll just, I don't know, I think time is up. So